All right, and we're back. Okay, so this is the third of our videos, and hopefully the last one. What we're going to do now that you've got your rough draft of your statements, and I use the term interchangeably, question statements. It means the same thing. They're supposed to be in the form of statements, as I said. What the next thing on the cheat sheet is to choose your sample. Now, the reason why I actually have you choosing your sample now, even though you're not going to be handing them out to people until after you get this survey back with a grade, is because you're going to need to figure out, in terms of what with your demographic variables, what you might need to know. And so in order to make the decisions about what can you leave on there and what do you need to take off, that's going to be dependent upon who your sample is going to be. Now, I really don't care who your sample is in this sense, because you're not going to be able to do a random sample, right? You're not going to so don't even call it random, right? When you get to that point, don't even say I'm going to have a random I picked a random sample of people. What you're going to do instead is you realize that with this type of sample, a random sample would allow you to generalize to a larger group of people. Say, like, if you were going to say, this is how DMAC students feel about something, you would have to, first of all, have a list of, first of all, you'd have to define what you mean by DMAC student. Is it anybody who's enrolled currently? Is it anybody who's been enrolled in the last year? Does that include online classes? Does it include people who are part-time versus people who are full-time? Right? So you'd have to define that first. Then you'd have to have a list of all those people which you don't have access to. Oh, and by the way, I don't even have access to. I'd have to have special permission to even do that, to have that list myself. You're not going to get that list. So what that has to do with is that you're going to need to decide who you're going to give it out to. So you might decide that you're going to give them all out to other DMAC students. Fine. You might also decide, depending on what your topic is, you might decide that you might want to give them out to other people. You might want to give them out to coworkers. Maybe it's relevant to where you work. So maybe if you're in criminal justice, for example, I see you out there. You're going to, maybe some of your criminal justice peers, or maybe even your professors in criminal justice, might have a unique perspective that you want to capture with your survey. Also, for example, you might want to hand them out to. So I've had people, although you have to be a little more careful with this. I've had people that were interested in having something to do with younger people, like how people in high school feel about underage drinking, say, as a social problem or as some kind of an issue. And then so they said, well, Gary, can I hand some of these out to high school students? Yes, you can, but you have to get special permission to do that. You're going to have to go through the principal of that school. Maybe it's your high school that you went to, so maybe you've got a kind of an inroad there, but you're going to have to get permission, and you might even have to do something special, like have permission slips that kids send home and have their parents sign it, because they're underage, most of them. And so it's kind of a pain in the butt. The reason why you don't have to do that in college, if you're giving them out to college students or people out in the community that are adults, is because it's called implied consent. That if you say, will you take my survey, and they have the right to say no, which means that if they do take it, they're giving consent by taking it. So with that implied consent, that sort of lets you off the hook in terms of ethics. But when you're talking about underage people, that's a whole different ballgame. So before you kind of go down that rabbit hole, make sure that you think through and talk to people about who you're going to hand it out to and that kind of thing. So you're going to figure out who your sample is going to be. Maybe, for example, you want to you're very interested in, and or think it's relevant that men might have very different opinions about this than women. Remember, we talked about for my intro students, we talked about how Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, while looking at moral development, had very different ideas about who should be asked, or studied. Kohlberg was the kind of the old school sexist group that only, and he only studied boys, and then said this is how people develop their morality. And why that's relevant is because Carol Gilligan came around decades later and said, you know what, we socialize men and women differently. So maybe men and women develop their morality in different ways through this because of the socialization process. Given that, if I'm asking questions about something that's relevant, that might be relevant to that there might be what we call a gender effect, I definitely want to make sure that I have like kind of a mixed bag there. So maybe I want to purposely hand out 15 to males and 15 to females in order to be able to compare those two groups when it comes to the time that I'm going to do my data analysis. Okay. So there's that. So that's having to do with your sample. You got to put some thought into it. Remember I said that the reason why I give you the template and all these other things and all these directions is because there's a lot of thinking involved in this, a lot of critical analysis, a lot of, you really kind of chewing on these things, because this is the part that I'm talking about, right? You have to think these things through, and there has to be logic behind it. Okay, so the next thing is you've got your questions or statements, and you're going to make sure that you're going to have to type them into your survey template or your own survey that you created if you want. Some people decide, for example, that they want to do them on something like online, like SurveyMonkey or Quick Surveys. Fine, you want to do that? Go for it. That way, that has some advantages, because even though if you use the free versions of these things, you have to be kind of careful because they only allow you so many questions before you have to pay for it. But many of my students have done this. They've been able to make them fit. That you can also choose some demographic variables in there. And the thing that's positive about that is sometimes you can actually get a much bigger sample size that way. And the minimum is going to be 30. But quick surveys and SurveyMonkey, you can once you create it, you get a link. You can post that on your social media. You can tweet it out to people, your followers. You can send it to friends on Facebook, and you can ask people, hey, I'm doing this survey for my class. Could you please go on and complete it for me? And sometimes you can, and maybe even share it with other people and ask them to do it too. So you can very quickly get a lot of people answering this. Oh, and by the way, the SurveyMonkey, I'm not sure about quick surveys, but SurveyMonkey will actually give you your data. So you don't even have to calculate it. It's pretty cool. And I know a lot of you guys are techno nerds like I am, so if I were to do it, that's how I would do it. I wouldn't even bother with the survey template or handing them out in person. But that's also a valuable thing to be able to do, right? To have what we call a paper and pencil questionnaire. So that's something that you could do. But when you're typing in your statements, you want to make sure that this is not a time for you to try to use your intellect and your massive vocabulary. And why? Because you want to make sure that each one of those statements is so clear and so simple that everyone that you hand it out to interprets it the same way. Now think about that for a minute. If I give you an exam, which you guys have next week, I give you an exam and I have a question on there that's really complicated, like that the wording of the question is really complicated, and some of you interpret it one way, and maybe that's how I meant for you to interpret it, but some of you read it and interpret it a different way. Am I really measuring that concept, or am I measuring just something else? And the answer is, I don't know. Because if I start putting in lots and lots of big words, lots of 50-cent words, so that you think I'm really smart, that might boost my ego a little bit. But how valuable is going to be is that data going to be? So the keep it simple, stupid idea, right? Make it as simple as possible. Don't use big words. Anytime you can make it simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler, the better. Because that means that everyone is likely to interpret it the same way. You also want to make sure that you deal with bias. Now, let's talk just a minute about bias. You have bias. Yes, you do. And what I mean by that is that you already have an opinion about this, especially if you're picking something that you're interested in. You've already got bias. You've already got an opinion about it. You have an opinion about people's opinions about abortion. That's probably why you picked the topic. You have an opinion about undocumented immigration. That's probably why you picked the topic. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with you having an opinion about that. But we're not dealing with opinions, we're dealing with science. And we're not interested in our opinion, we're interested in other people's opinions. We're interested in their attitudes about this topic. So how do we deal with that? How do we not telegraph to them in the way we write our statements? How do we not make them realize that we have this bias? Well, there are actually ways to do this. One is that you can switch around the wording. So if I were to be asking people about their opinions about, say, undocumented immigration, I might put, one statement might say, undocumented immigrants are criminals, gang members, and drug dealers. Right? That's a real opinion that sometimes people have out there, even some of our presidential candidates. Now, never mind that it's mostly factually false. Right? I mean, never let some facts get in the way of a good story, right? Especially in politics. But certainly, that's if that's how you feel, and that's how you put all of your statements in there as kind of with this bias going this one direction, you're going to change their opinion. At least it's going to influence how they answer those questions. And you don't want that, right? You want their true opinions about it. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can word some of your statements, maybe half of them, word them the other direction. And so instead of kind of making it sound like undocumented immigrants are bad, you might actually word several of them in positive ways. And you might say, undocumented immigrants are some of the hardest working people in our country. Right? So that at least is going to offset the other one. And the goal is, by the way, is not for you to not have bias, because we know you do, I do, right? Even as researchers, you're going to have some bias. But you don't want them to know what your bias is. What you want is for them to be able to take your survey and walk away from that survey not having a freaking clue what your opinion is. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So you're going to try to get rid of any errors that are there. Do not, clean up your, one way to do that as far as knowing whether or not it's simple and easy is read it out loud. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but it really does work. If you read it out loud, this is no different than some of you have taken, your writing classes, and if you have a really good professor, they'll tell you, read out loud your what you've written. Because if you read it and you kind of stumble over it and it just sounds awkward, it is awkward. So the same thing applies here. If you read your statements out loud and it sounds awkward, then you need to reword it. Make it simpler, right? Change the way that it's written. So that's one way that you can try to get rid of some of those kind of errors. Look for misspellings. in Microsoft Word, those are the ones with a little wiggly red line underneath. Yeah, you don't have to leave them the way they are. Really, you don't have to. You can actually go in, right click on it, and find the correct spelling. Oh, by the way, also, 2, 2, and 2. T-O, T-O-O, and T-W-O are different words. I know, it's crazy. And they mean different things. Yeah. So, don't hand in something that appears like you didn't really put much thought into it, because I can see that. And I'm a smart guy. So if you hand in something that kind of looks half-assed, that doesn't pump me full of confidence that you actually put much thought into this. Also, so you've got errors. Clean it up, make it look good. Because once you hand them out to people later on, after you get a grade, you're going to be stuck with whatever you have. You can't change it. Once you started handing them out and people start filling them out, you're stuck with whatever you have. If you have error in there, you're just going to have to deal with it. Or start all over. And I don't think you guys have the time for that. So, and you want to get rid of all the bias. Okay. Now, the last thing, is obviously save this often, so that each time you make a change to it, you've got that saved. And then what you want to do is you're going to need to print off a copy on that you can bring to class that has your survey, because you're going to hand in a paper copy. Even if you do SurveyMonkey or something, still you're going to need to print it off. And then you're going to write your name on it, because if you don't have your name on it, I don't know who you are. Yeah, I can't give you a grade. And that's tragic. And yet somehow I'll find the strength to go on. Okay, so put your name on it and then turn it in. And what will happen is I will grade them as quickly as possible, and I will get them back to you. And once I get them back to you, what I'll do is I'll mark up. If I see something that I think is a problem that you might need to make some changes to before you actually hand them out, I'm going to write that down. I'll say reword this, or I may make some kind of comment about it. And then I will. Then you can go through it and see whether or not it's something that you need to change. And then before you hand them out to people, okay? So that's where, after you get that back, then we're going to start with project 2, and maybe I'll do some more of these videos to kind of help out with that too. But for the meantime, what you need to be doing is finishing up this project. You're not going to have to hand them out or anything yet. Don't hand them out to people. Instead, what you're going to do is you're just creating it, and you're going to hand it in. All right. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Have a good weekend, as a matter of fact. What the heck? And we'll talk again.